I believe we are live right now. I'm just typing in a quick message here to the group. Welcome from Mumbai, India. Wonderful.
Hello, everyone.
It's amazing. I'll give a couple of seconds here for everybody to come online before we start the stream. Maybe I'll just share this slide here as people are coming on board. And I'm very, very happy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those from all around the world that are logging in. I see people as far from London, India, Canada, the United States. Just a terrific representation. And welcome to day 5 of TMF week. Unfortunately, our last day. Well, maybe fortunately for some, those that have been working very, very hard behind the scenes that most of us do not see in these. A big thank you to the entire staff and those that have been working hard to put this together. Maybe on that note, what I can do is start the official introduction to day 5 of TMF week, implementing an eTMF at a scaling CRO. Steps for success is today's first session of the day. My name is Michael Pupil. I'm the head of sales at Montreal. Incredibly excited to have everybody today and to be joining into day 5, where we have 2 wonderful speakers, our very own Maisha Rahim and Allphase's Tatiana Esquivel, who are going to be talking today in somewhat of a joint session together. So maybe just a little bit of housekeeping, and for those of you that have been part of these sessions, nothing new here. It's the encouragement of putting in Q&A, for the speakers. We want to try and tackle as many questions as possible. I've had the delight of touching base with a number of people that have gone to a lot of these sessions, and speakers alike that have mentioned that there have been some wonderful takeaways from this. Tatiana was sharing some of her feedback as well, which was always well received. And a lot of it is due to the questions that you guys are putting into the chat. So please do that, and we'll tackle it towards the end of the session. Of course, each attendee will receive a record of attendance. And like we've been discussing with the teams or everybody that has been logging in, that all of these recordings will be available on the TMF Week dashboard, and they'll be available for roughly a period of about 30 days on the system. So, next week, the week after, once it's concluded, we encourage everybody to go in there, download what it is that you'd like to see, because it isn't going to be there forever. It is going to be there for a specific period of time. So you've got 30 days to kind of take that piece down. So that brings me into the introductions of today's speakers. I mentioned Maisha and Tatiana, and maybe I'll start with the introductions here. And as a product specialist, Maisha is involved in the day-to-day of client experience at Montreal, starting from the onboarding of new clients, providing training and checking in with existing clients to ensure smooth user adoption. Maisha holds a degree in chemical engineering from McGill University and has been with Montreal for a long time. And I've had the pleasure of working with her over my career at Montreal as well. Tatiana, who works as a clinical study associate for Allphase Clinical Research, a CRO based in Ottawa, Ontario, here in Canada, and has been with them for over 6 years. As a CSA, she provides support to their project managers, which includes setting up and maintaining study TMFs. And it's been a great pleasure working alongside Tatiana and the team at Allphase. So this introduction is near and dear to my heart. With that, I will turn it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. I will go ahead and share my screen. I believe you might need to stop sharing first. Okay. Perfect. And if I could just have confirmation from you, Mike, whether you can see my screen.
Should be up.
Okay, perfect. So thank you for that, Mike. And hello, everybody. Welcome to today's session on implementing an eTMF at a scaling CRO, steps for success. In this session, we will be taking a look at a case study on the implementation of an eTMF system at Allphase, which is a Canadian CRO that implemented eTMF Connect last year. Okay, so taking a look at the agenda, we will start with a brief introduction to Allphase and talk about how they were managing their TMF before moving to an eTMF system and what really motivated them to make that switch. We'll talk about the implementation process of eTMF Connect as experienced by the Allphase team and some best practices for that onboarding process. We will then dive into some of the challenges and lessons learned, as well as the benefits and the overall experience from the Allphase side, having had an eTMF in place for about a year now. Okay, so to kick things off, I'll hand it over to Tatiana to provide a brief introduction to Allphase.
Maisha. So as Mike had mentioned, Allphase is a full-service CRO that is based in Ottawa in Canada. We've been providing phase 2 to 4 clinical research services to the pharma, biotech, and medical device industry for over 20 years. As of January 2020, Allphase was acquired by the Calian Group, which is a Canadian-owned and publicly traded company. And our repeat business rate and phenomenal growth is a result of our focus on positive customer experience, as well as our ability to quickly adapt to the changing landscape to meet the needs of our customers.
And Allphase started the implementation of eTMF Connect in April of 2020, right? Perfect. So do you want to give us a little bit of the lay of the land in terms of how you managed your TMF before that and what really motivated you to make that switch?
Absolutely. So before Allphase migrated into an eTMF, we were using paper TMFs. And as you can imagine, that posed a number of challenges. The first of all being the cost of the supplies. So as an example, we had a 15-site observational real-world evidence study, and that TMF ended up being composed of about 50 2 to 4 inch binders. Now, the cost of getting those supplies to create a 50 binder TMF ended up being well over $1,000. And it leads me into my next challenge, because you can also imagine that you need a lot of storage space to house that 50 binder TMF, which translates into the sponsor needing a lot of space to archive it. So that was quite the challenge. But I think the most significant challenge with the paper TMF was how difficult it was for the sponsor to oversee it, because we are based in Ottawa, but many of our sponsors are not, meaning that they would either need to travel to the Allphase offices to physically see their TMF, which incurs travel costs on their end. Allphase could also scan them documents, which is fine unless the sponsor needs a large volume of documents, and at that point it becomes burdensome for Allphase. We tried to mitigate this with creating very detailed trackers of the TMF contents and providing this to the sponsor so they knew what was in their TMFs without physically needing to see it. But I mean, a tracker is just very open to error, right? To entering the wrong information into a spreadsheet. And that brings me to my next risk, which thankfully had never happened to us, but it is still quite a risk nonetheless. And that's the risk of losing the TMF, because if you ever had a fire or a flood in your TMF room, there is no way for you to back up a paper TMF, and you could try to recreate it from emails, maybe getting copies of documents from the site binders. But that is just a labor-intensive process, and there's no way to guarantee that you're going to completely replicate the original. So all of this really led Allphase into exploring eTMF options that would make the TMF more accessible, more efficient, and provide better visibility to the sponsor. And we ended up going with Montreal as our TMF vendor.
Perfect. And I would imagine that with the world turning upside down last year with the global pandemic, your points about visibility and accessibility becomes all that much more important, right?
Oh, yes. Having the ability to access the TMF remotely, both the sponsors and our study teams during COVID, that has been essential to us maintaining our productivity during the study.
Absolutely. Okay, so once Allphase decided to move to an eTMF system, selected eTMF Connect, that's actually when I met Tatiana and the Allphase team, and we began working together on the implementation. And in terms of that implementation of eTMF Connect, I can go into the details of what that process looked like, with the different steps of that process being shown on my screen here. So first here we have initiate, and we initiated the implementation project with a few meetings between the two teams, so between Montreal and Allphase. and we planned out the details of the project, including the goals, objectives, and deliverables. We then have a step here for controls. So this is where you want to start thinking about the procedural controls or SOPs that need to be put in place as you are switching from a paper-based TMF to an eTMF. And from the Montrium side, we do provide templates that can be leveraged for those SOPs. Next comes my favorite piece of the process, and that's training, to get your key users familiar with the system and discuss how the system can be used for your business processes. The validation step that we have next here is entirely based on the validation approach that is chosen. And from the Montrium side, we always recommend taking a risk-based approach. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple of slides. We then help to personalize your production environment with your organization-specific information, following which you are ready to launch the system. And so this is when you can start thinking about your end user training, migrating in your documents, and rolling the system out to the larger team. Okay, so this is the standard implementation process that we follow at Montrium. And as you can imagine, the length of time that it takes to complete all of these steps can really vary from one organization to another, depending on a number of different factors, such as resource availability, business constraints, etc. At Allphase, this process was extremely streamlined. And as you can see with the timeline here, and Tatiana, I'll hand it over to you again to speak to the timeline in a little bit more detail.
Thank you. So we have here the timeline for implementing eTMF Connect at Allphase. We had our onboarding kickoff meeting on the 17th of April of last year, and we started our training at the end of that month. Training took about a week. So we finished it on the 6th of May, and then a week later we had our validation documents complete. By the end of May, we had transferred our existing studies into eTMF Connect, and by June 1st, we went live. All in all, the process took about 6 weeks to complete, thanks in large part because we went with Montrium's streamlined approach to validation. And we felt very well supported during the process. The training was very thorough and the documentation was very well done.
Amazing. And I would say that the fast and successful implementation at Allphase was definitely also attributable to the Allphase team's ability to complete the steps that we had seen earlier in such an efficient way. And based on our onboarding experience, we have also highlighted here some best practices, if you will, that helped to make that implementation a success. So first up, we find it so valuable to have a strategy session where you can discuss and outline the project goals and deliverables. So for example, is there a specific date by which you want to be live with the system? Or are there any business constraints that need to be taken into account for the project planning, like out of offices, or perhaps an audit period where the key members of the team will not be available for this project? So this is a great opportunity for the two teams to make sure that they are in alignment with regards to the implementation process itself, as well as the deliverables. And this brings me to my next point here, of clearly defining the project deliverables at the very beginning. So this includes deciding on that validation approach and determining what validation documents you need to keep on file and what you will be producing as a part of the implementation process, what SOPs need to be created or updated, and so on and so forth. So clearly defining those deliverables from the beginning ensures that you can keep sufficient time within the project planning timeline to ensure that you have all of those deliverables done. We also recommend that you define a project team from the start of the project, including the main project manager, who will be responsible for coordinating the tasks to be completed by that project team. The key users, for example, who will be trained on the system and will become subject matter experts and will help to produce the deliverables for the project, as well as any individuals that may be taking on specific administrative roles in the system, and so they might need to be trained accordingly. Okay, so when it comes to training that we have here as a point next, we do advocate for the train the trainer approach, where your key users are trained to become subject matter experts. And we find that this is so helpful in terms of ensuring that those training sessions are as productive as they can be, because not only are those super users, as we like to call them, becoming subject matter experts of the system and learning everything that the system is capable of, but they're also being able to discuss how the system can be used to match the required business processes. And essentially what this means is that in that case, the training becomes more like a workshop where you're discussing how the system can be personalized for your organization. And then these key users are, after that initial training, responsible for training the remaining end users based on the processes that you will be using the system for. Okay, so for validation next, we had said earlier that we always recommend a risk-based approach. And at Montreal, our solutions are actually pre-qualified. So you have the option of leveraging the testing done by Montreal and keeping documentation such as qualification certificates and compliance statements on file. On the other hand, you can choose to run some of your own testing, in which case we would support that by providing user acceptance test scripts for you. But the important point here is to decide on the approach that you will be taking, because the project timeline and deliverables will be heavily dependent on that. And next, we have the rollout to the larger team. And some key considerations here would be how, or rather maybe who would be training those end users. And you would need to determine access levels. And there's also that whole change management aspect where you really need to plan out how you will drive user adoption. And we often find that having a key user or users be the champions, or the internal champions, if you will, of the system really goes a long way in driving that user adoption and change management process.
Maisha, just a quick note, sorry to interrupt. If you could just flick on your camera on and off, you've frozen. Just to give you.
I look okay on my end. Is that better?
Yeah, perfect, thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Mike. Okay. So the final point that we have here is the migration of documents. So you will need to determine which studies will be brought into the eTMF, especially if you're moving from paper-based TMF. And you could do a risk analysis in this case. And once you do determine which documents need to be brought in, you'll also have to decide how you will be migrating those documents or studies and who will be taking charge of that project. Okay, so these are some of the keys to a successful implementation. But of course, as with any type of project, there are always some hurdles and some things that could have been done better. So at this point, I will hand it back to Tatiana to give us some insights into the challenges and lessons learned from the Allphase experience.
So challenges, as with any implementation for a new system, we did face some challenges. The first one being mindset. So because we have used paper-based systems for so long, it was really tricky to imagine how an electronic solution might work for us. And I can say here with emphasis, don't fall into the trap of trying to find a system that's going to perfectly match the paper-based processes that you're currently using. You really have to be open to finding new ways of managing a TMF, even if that means that you're going to need to develop new processes. And that, of course, leads into the next challenge, which is Allphase had the need to develop new processes. For example, we created internal processes about how you create the TMF and Connect, how you perform the periodic reviews or the TMF QCs in the system, and also access management, which, as a side note, the access management for an eTMF was a challenge in and of itself because it is far more complex than what you would require for paper. But we did create internal processes to try to guide our users on how to do these tasks. These processes were developed based on our initial understanding of the system after we had our training, and also in part on what we wanted the system to do. But now that we've had that year of experience using Connect, and as new features become available, we do need to go reassess our internal processes that we initially developed and revise them and streamline them to make sure that they are giving our users the most accurate instruction and information possible. So all this to say that continuous improvement really is a reality when you implement a new system. The next challenge that came with the new system is how to train staff, and now you need to train the sponsor on how to use this system. Thankfully, Montreal did provide us with the recordings of our initial training, and we also had access to their Help Center articles, which are very detailed, very well written. And all of these things came together to help Allphase develop our internal training program that we roll out to staff. Now, in addition to that training program, we also provide demos to staff and to the sponsor. That's how we train the sponsors. We provide demos of the system, show them the different features, show them how you find documents within Connect. And it is really easy to do that when the interface of the system is the way it is, which is very user-friendly, and it's really easy to navigate. So those are our challenges and lessons learned through this whole process.
Amazing, and all very good points, and thank you for sharing these. I'm sure that if there is anyone on the line who is planning an eTMF implementation, it'll be very helpful to keep these points in mind so that maybe you won't face some of these same challenges, or you can plan how to tackle them. And now that Allphase has been using an eTMF for about a year now, Tatiana, could you perhaps tell us some of the benefits that you've seen, as well as summarize that overall experience?
Absolutely. So we talked about earlier when we were talking about the reasons why Allphase switched to eTMF. One of the biggest benefits was the fact that sponsors and study teams can access that TMF remotely, which is extremely crucial during the pandemic. If I can put it into context, being able to log into my computer and access my TMF from really anywhere, my kitchen, my study, that is extremely useful when you are under a work from home order and you are not supposed to leave the house for non-essential reasons, and therefore cannot hop over to your TMF room and pull out that binder to look at the paper. The next benefit, though, with having TMF in an electronic form is that we no longer need to have those large amounts of binders and paper, which means less storage room for us and also means less archiving room needed by the sponsor. It also means less printing overall for the study. And I can't say that it's zero printing right now at this time, because Allphase does still generate paper binders that go to the sites, but it is less printing overall. And specific to the eTMF Connect system, you have a navigator in the system, which is a really great way of viewing the overall health of your TMF. Or if you wanted to look at different sections, even different sites. It also features filters, and I have a slide here where I've highlighted the different filters because it makes me so happy that I can use different ways of locating and viewing a document. Going back to context, if I were looking for an email in a study that went on for 2 years, I really have to hope that that email occurred early on in the study or maybe later in the study, so I don't have to go through 2 years worth of email in paper form. In an eTMF, I could filter on a section to find a particular email. I could filter on a site, or even better, if I didn't want to go through the whole system, I can export a listing in Excel and just hit Control Find and find my email that way. So the convenience of it has been fantastic. I guess overall you can get the sense that Allphase had a really positive experience with Montreal. Going from the implementation, which was straightforward, it was very well supported. Post-implementation, Montreal support has been very responsive when we've had issues perhaps using a feature in the system, and they're always really open to any feedback that we provide about ways to improve the system. And just overall, using the system over this year, we found that it's fast, it's user-friendly, it's easy to walk through, which has been great.
I love to hear that. And that actually brings us to the end of our presentation for today. So we can open up the floor at this point to any questions, perhaps. Try and find the Q&A section here.
Yeah. And sorry for removing myself. I wanted to kind of give us a little bit more of a, or Tatiana, a little bit more screen share, because I think we were getting cut off half. So I was around the entire time watching you guys and listening to you guys, and that was a wonderful session, both of you. There is a couple that did come through. There was one from Manoj, which I thought was really interesting and something that we see often, Tatiana, and I'd love to get your opinion here. Manoj asked, what is the sponsor thought on eTMF management outsourcing to a CRO, or do they want to do it themselves by subscribing to an eTMF tool? Maybe I'll give you part one to that, and I'll share some insights on the other side.
Sure. In our experience for Allphase, most of our sponsors really, when they contract Allphase to manage the study, it is Allphase managing that TMF in however form that we are using. Before we migrated to eTMF, it would have been through paper. Now that we have eTMF Connect, we let the sponsors know that it is being used. We are managing their TMF through the system. The sponsors in general, when we present the system to them, seem to be quite happy with it. In fact, one of the sponsors for the study, for a study we migrated into eTMF Connect once it was implemented, was really happy to know that she could now go into a system and just access her documents that way instead of having to email them to her.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, because there are definitely two sides of the coin, right? Typically, a CRO will provide TMF management services as part of the relationship between CRO and sponsor. And not all sponsors subscribe to an eTMF tool. And really what we see and what we feel, and I'd love to encourage any comments from those that are attending, is that there typically is a tipping point that outsourcing TMF is not an abnormal thing. In fact, most clinical studies are conducted by CROs. But there is a tipping point at some point where the sponsor turns around and says that they want to, own the control of the systems. And it wouldn't be surprising if in that scenario, Tatiana, that in the near future, that sponsor will probably subscribe, whether it be Montreal or another system. I think they'll want to take control in-house. And I dare say a sponsor has an eTMF system already and conducts conversations with a CRO to preclude them from utilizing that other system as well. So it's a really insightful question, Manoj. I think that was great. Yeah. Tatiana, you touched on a little bit of this during the presentation, but I'd love to dig a little bit deeper, because you said something that really stuck with me, which was the change process that came through. Because Allphase was more of a paper or manual based process before for so long, it wasn't necessarily the technology side of things that was the assessment. I think the hardest part was the change in behavior from Allphase employees. So not to bring you back to that time, because we're in the road for sure, but I was wondering if you could talk about some of those disruptions and how you overcame them with the team.
So I think the first and foremost difficulty with changing the mindset is how to perform these periodic reviews. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we came up with really detailed trackers of the TMF content. Many of our periodic reviews would often be performed on that tracker against the TMF, and we're so ingrained in using that process that we may have thought about doing that when we moved to eTMF, and then shortly after thinking about it, realized that that was insanity. There's no point in doing that because you do have the ability to do export listings from the system. You know, we really needed to lean into those features that are supposed to make our lives easier. So I think that's one good example of where we needed to change the way that we thought about doing processes.
It's insightful, and I guess that goes to the continuous improvement that you were talking about before, right?
Exactly.
Unfortunately, everything changes. It's probably
it does, and sometimes you just have to roll with the punches.
yeah, and maybe come out better at the other end. Well said. Well said. I've got an interesting question, I think, more directed to you, Maisha. Do you have any? Because Tatiana, you mentioned migrating studies and moving these over. So here's a question going down the alley of migration, Maisha. Do you have any insights you can share about migration best practices? Do you think it's better to move an eTMF system while an organization is small, or wait until they're bigger?
Oh, what a great question. And I can go on and on about that, but I'll try to keep it as short as possible. Definitely doing that risk analysis at the very beginning when you are implementing an eTMF to decide which studies you want to bring in is going to go a long way in terms of making sure that the documents that that need to be in that eTMF or the studies that need to be in the eTMF, you can have that plan in place already in terms of which ones you'll be bringing in. There's also the point of determining at what point you're doing that migration, and this is especially crucial for your ongoing studies because you will need to think of sort of a freeze date when you'll stop collecting or adding to your paper TMF, and from that point on, you'll be bringing everything into that eTMF system. In general, regardless of the migration approach you choose, I always recommend having a migration plan in place where you detail out the steps that will take place so that you can always refer back to that original plan, and scoping out that migration from the very beginning to have a clear idea of which documents need to be brought into the eTMF system really makes sure that you can perform the QC checks after to make sure everything that you intended to bring in is in the system with all of the right metadata or properties assigned.
Amazing. That's really good insight. And maybe just a spin-off question in the same topic, but directed to you, Tatiana. There is a question that came through that asks, did you transition existing paper studies to the eTMF or only start new studies in the eTMF Connect platform?
No, we actually did transition one of our ongoing studies. It was kind of in that startup going into maintenance phase. Mm-hmm. We did transition that completely into eTMF, which wasn't too hard because we already had a lot of those documents scanned. So it wasn't very hard to move them into eTMF. There were some studies we had that were made towards their end stage that were on paper that we assessed, and we didn't think it was worth the time and effort to move into eTMF, especially if they were closing out in a few months. But yes, we did move existing studies. We did move studies that were just starting into the system. So
yeah, I think it goes to that first step that Maisha was talking about, is the plan, and then the assessment, does this make sense? So it is completely possible to do either or. And at the end of the day, you're in charge of deciding. Lene asks a really interesting question here, more towards vendor selection. So I'll point this to you, Tatiana. Did you perform a vendor selection audit or use a questionnaire in the assessment?
We did perform a vendor assessment, which includes a questionnaire. Unfortunately, I can't speak too much more to that because that's really held within our QA department, but I do know that a vendor assessment was done, which does include a very detailed questionnaire.
Yeah, and without opening up anything there, an audit or questionnaire or assessment, I'll just say should be part of the process. There's nothing wrong with, I'll use the word shopping and person. And while technology is out there and a lot of technology is similar, not all technologies are built for every organization that's out there. So the technology is one piece of things, but I think there's also things to take into consideration, like a cultural fit, the personalities of the teams. There's all the intangibles that go into selecting a partner, not just eTMF, but I think that probably holds true to any vendor assessment that's out there. When it comes to technology, I dare say that all technology is probably obsolete a year after you purchased it. There should be features and benefit, like there's things to the system that are added. It should look different, as time passes. And so that too is going to be an evolution. One thing that would be constant is the relationship, hopefully getting stronger between buyer and seller. And so I would probably add that to the questionnaire piece in the evaluation. If anybody is looking for that, it should be something that you would consider. Maria asks a question, and I don't know who I'd point this to, maybe both of you, but Maria asks a question: how do you ensure confidentiality of the information? Great question.
I would say access control, and Tatiana, you can add to that as you would like, but I think that's one of the biggest advantages of moving to an eTMF system, because the access to all of your documents is dependent on the permissions that you assign to your different users who will be granted accounts for the system. And essentially, there should be different levels of access, ideally by either folder or zone or section. So and perhaps you can restrict access based on the level of confidentiality or risk of those documents. So I don't know, Tatiana, if you want to add to that.
No, I absolutely agree. That's really how we maintain confidentiality of documents in specific studies in Connect. We make sure we're assigning the appropriate access levels so that, I can't see documents in studies that don't belong to me. And others can't see, others that aren't part of my study team can't see documents that don't belong to them. That's really the best way to ensure confidentiality.
Yeah, absolutely. There's, I guess, a subset of this question here, because it revolves around users. There's a question specifically to you, Tatiana. Tatiana, how quickly did users become comfortable with the eTMF system? Was there anything in particular users struggled with?
That's a good question. I want to say that when we launched Connect, and I guess this is just for full transparency, the studies that we transferred into the system were studies I worked on, and I was part of the training, so I was very comfortable with the system. We have a new project manager, one of the studies, who had never used this system. It did maybe take her about a month to really feel comfortable navigating it, and she does feel comfortable using the features now. She especially loves that export feature. So I guess it just depends on the person's level of comfort with technology in general. If they're not a tech-savvy person, an eTMF might be daunting. If they are really quick to catch on, then I think their comfort level is a little higher. But in terms of things we might still struggle with, that might be that access management piece. As I mentioned earlier, it's a whole other beast compared to what you needed to do for a paper TMF. So trying to remember what levels of access you need to assign, permissions you need to give someone in order to do a certain task, that is currently kind of still our learning curve.
Absolutely. I would say with that practice, right, yeah, comfort comes with familiarity. And so everything that you do for the first time is likely a little bit uncomfortable, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes, the more comfortable you are. And whether it's technology or anything else, if there are best practices, if there is a support system, if there is proper training, if there is communication and transparency, and it just comes down to user, practice, and then it becomes pretty good. Tatiana, you were talking about how some of that ease of use was studies that you were transferring. Darshana asks an interesting question, and already I think I know the answer to this because TMF and the model has evolved over the years, but the question specifically is, what is your view on ongoing transferring 10-year-old studies to eTMF, and what would be the biggest challenge?
For a 10-year-old study, I commend your patience for it. But I think it kind of goes back to the challenge. So what the study that we transferred that was ongoing had been going on for, I'd say, about 4 years at the time that we transferred it. So it was a long-term study. It did take quite a few hours to get those documents in. We had to do the QC checks once they were in. So I guess I could advise be very patient with it. It's a process that's going to take time, especially if it's a longer study and it implies more documentation. I don't know what phase it is, but if it's a phase 2 or 3, there's probably more documentation involved. It's just to have patience and know that you will want to do that QC once everything's in there, to check that everything.
Yeah. And Maisha, maybe if you could add a couple of words, because I know that you have tackled countless migration projects, for Montreal over the time. What would you say would be the biggest challenge with something like that?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that. One is just determining sort of timelines and keeping that realistic in terms of resource management on your end as well. So if these are paper TMFs for a 10-year-long study, who's going to be doing the scanning and bringing them into the system? And then I think I'd like to sort of reiterate Tatiana's point about doing those QC checks. I think those are really imperative in terms of making sure everything that you intend to bring into the system really makes it in there with all the right information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I dare say that the reference model has certainly come and been adapted over that time. And so I think the idea is to, be able to get it to a point that reflects today's reality, which 10 years ago is probably very different than what it is today. So I definitely see those as challenges. Tatiana, I'll ask one last question that comes in here from Anonymous, and it's an interesting question and one that I don't think we've ever asked, but maybe we should have during this journey. What made you select Montreal over other eTMF vendors? 3 question marks at the end of that one.
I want to preface it with saying that I myself was not involved with the vendor assessment for Montreal, so I can't give I don't know the concrete reasons. I do know from feedback from our team that Montreal had all of the features that we were looking for. Overall, the streamlined approach to validation was definitely a big highlight because we wanted something we were going to be able to implement quickly. And I think just the overall experience with the implementation team we had when we were getting demos of the system, we just found that the team was very open, friendly. They're Canadian based, which is fantastic. You always want to work with a company that's kind of in the same realm that you are and may understand the same challenges you might be having. So I think those were the biggest reasons that I've heard from the team about why Montreal was selected.
That's very kind. Raul asks a really good question. I think maybe more specific to you, Raul, because you're heavily involved in working inside of the eTMF. Raul asks, how was your experience with eTMF Navigator?
With the Navigator, I was very happy to be working with something that could give me those kind of very quick statistics. Like I love seeing percentages right off the bat of how my TMF is doing because it alerts me if there's an issue right away. But I think the look of the eTMF Navigator is probably the thing I like the most because it's very clear, it's very concise, everything is in a section, and it's very easy to use that way.
Amazing. I know we're wrapping up towards the end of time, so what I'll do is maybe just cut it here. And like I said, this one was a session that I was very excited about. It was something that was near and dear to my heart. I was happy to be part of the group that was working alongside many of the Allphase members, many of the Montreal members, and something that I wholeheartedly hope that continues for many, many years to come. So Tatiana, thank you for participating in today's session. Maisha, as always, thank you for your participation and work as well.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Following this session, we're going to be moving into another networking break. Our following session after that, in roughly about 15 minutes from now, is going to be entitled Tell a Better TMF Story Using Integrated Systems for a More Holistic Approach. That will be delivered by two of Montrim's own, President and CEO Paul Fenton, as well as Catherine Cinturelli, who is one of our product owners at Montrim as well. So following the networking session, I hope to see you guys at some of the tables, continue these wonderful questions. And again, ladies, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for logging in today.
Thanks everyone for joining.
Hey, everyone.